Several times today, we've sort of touched on some of the social science issues. We talked about social data, user-generated data. We talked about intuition and organizational change. But here we have the real thing. And I'm really delighted to introduce this panel. My colleague, Jeff Nunberg, who is a linguist and a commentator, a political commentator on language, will moderate and contribute as well, I'm sure. Mark Lieberman, who is a linguist, a professor in linguistics and information science at the University of Pennsylvania, and Mark Salganik, who is a professor of sociology at Princeton University. I'm not going to spend time introducing them because I'd rather have them just dive in right now. So over to you, Jeff.
Okay, well, thank you, Anno. In Das Kapital, if you'll cast your minds back, Marx says that merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative change. And so I guess technology makes Marxists dialecticians of us all. In fact, it's interesting. The example Marx uses in that is how much money do you have to have before you suddenly become a capitalist, is his question. Something seems to happen, people feel, when you get to that 13th zero or 15th zero or 18th zero or 21st zero, wherever it is, and it's obviously a moving target. And bingo, it's the petabyte age. It's the age of big data. I think of it as like combing your hair. You know, you just comb and comb and comb and comb, and all of a sudden it's big hair. You know, it's sort of, And this has had an effect not only on all of the areas of commerce and research and computation that we've been listening to, hearing about, but also on the social sciences, needless to say. The question is whether the advent of big data changes the way we do social science, the way we think of social science, and also, and a question of particular interest to us at the iSchool, what role do social scientists play in the deployment of these data and the analytics all over the place, not simply in their own disciplines. So we're delighted to have Matt Salganik, who's a statistician turned sociologist. I think Hal Varian said that statistics is the sexy discipline of this decade. Well, sociology is going to be the sexy discipline of the next decade if Absolutely. Matt has anything to do about it. And Mark Lieberman, who was into big data before big data were big. In fact, he was into big data back when data was a plural noun. That's how far back he goes. So by way of starting off, I wanted to read a few lines from an article that appeared in Wired by Chris Anderson, who's the editor of Wired, back in 2008 when this big data was first becoming a buzzword. The title of the article was "The Data Deluge Makes the Scientific Method Obsolete." And he says, Google and like-minded companies are sifting through the most measured age in history, treating this massive corpus as a laboratory of the human condition. They are the children of the petabyte age, capital P, capital A. Out with every theory of human behavior from linguistics to sociology. Here it is. Forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is that they do it. And we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. And later, petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. Correlation supersedes causation. Science can advance without coherent models, and so on and so forth. Now, Chris Anderson is one of these people. Wired has a lot of these people as self-made straw man. But it does set up an interesting question. So let me turn maybe first to Matt. Do we need, where we're going, do we need science?
Well, the article did not convince me to retire. It did not convince me we don't need sociologists anymore. So I think one way to think about this is, I guess we could start with an example, the Google flu trends, which is something many of us have talked about today. So they had tons of data, and they were able to use this data to predict the CDC flu data. And they had a very careful analysis of this using data from 2003 to 2008. They published this in Nature, and the system seemed to be working very well until swine flu happened in 2009. It was a very different kind of environment. So swine flu was very different than regular seasonal influenza. It happened at a different time of year. It was covered very differently in the media. And then the Google flu trend system basically broke down. So at the moment we cared most about having this accurate data, the system stopped working as well. And they've since published a paper describing this and also showing that they can recalibrate their model, and now that it actually works really well until something else happens. And so one of the things I believe Andy talked about in his talk was what happens when there's a big change in the world. When there's a big change, it's not clear that we can use data from the past to just blindly predict what will happen in the future. And if we want to be able to understand from the past what will happen in the future, then we need to understand the mechanisms behind the patterns that we see. So it's one thing to see a pattern and it's another thing to understand why that pattern is happening. And so that understanding these mechanisms is what social scientists spend a lot of their time trying to do. And so that's something that I think is very valuable, but it's also valuable in lots of other applications, because if there's a pattern that you see in your data, and it's a pattern that you want to amplify, or it's a pattern that you want to dampen out, if you don't understand why that pattern is happening, any change you make to your system is probably not going to have the effect that you intend.
Mark, do you want to?
So I'll also tell a story. This is unfortunately not a story about science, but it is a story about data, and I think it has some lessons for the question of whether anything other than numbers and general statistical techniques might be needed in the future. A couple of years ago, a representative of a company called me up for some help with a problem that they had. This is a company that deals in network digital prescriptions. They currently deal with about 4 or 5 million prescriptions a day, I believe. Anyway, around 4 million. So it's not all of the prescriptions in the U.S. by any means, but it's plenty of them. The problem that they have is that 2 of the fields in these digital prescriptions that they get are supplied by doctors, are typed in by doctors who are not always careful. And one of these fields is what the medicine is, and the other field is the so-called sig field for signatur, which is Latin for let it be written, and it's instructions to the pharmacist for what to put on the label to tell the patient what to do with the medicine. And they noticed that a fair fraction, several percent of these prescriptions were in some way incoherent. They instructed patients to take 3 teaspoons of a bottle that contained tablets, or stuff like that. And so one of the things that they had to do was to hire registered pharmacists to check these prescriptions for coherence, because if they got all the way to the pharmacy that was supposed to dispense them, they would just get kicked back, and then they would have to contact the doctor, and it was a lot of trouble. But they had gotten the idea that perhaps these difficulties, these incoherences or inconsistencies, could be automatically detected and flagged. And so they asked for some help in doing it. So our first thought was, sure, we know how to do that. We have lots of training data. We have lots of strings of the sig field and of the medicine naming field. We have lots of lexical and other features. We throw it in a big pot and do a log linear model, basically one of the various kinds of machine learning models, and we'll get a result. Well, we sort of got a result, but it wasn't anywhere near the level of performance that they required. So we looked into it a little bit further, and we discovered that the problem had more internal structure than these methods, which are basically based on looking at what words occur and what word pairs occur and what letters might occur here and there and so forth, could easily deal with. And so we decided, just because these guys needed a practical solution, that we would just sit down and work it through. And the practical solution turned out to require basically writing what classical AI researchers would call a semantic grammar for each of these fields. Now, the semantics of these fields are pretty simple. You know, there's liquids, and there's tablets, and there's capsules, and there's a certain number that you're supposed to take, and you might be supposed to take them at certain times, or so many a day, and so on. So without boring you any further, let me just say that we were able to kind of figure out sort of what the semantic space was and what the ways that the doctors used to name pieces of the semantic space was. And we were able to pretty well solve the problem. But one of the things that I thought it was amusing to do was to ask, sort of consistent with this grammar that we've written and all the different ways that we found that doctors so far have misspelled or represented or reordered or inserted additional modifiers into or whatever these things, how many different sig fields might there in overall time be? And we concluded that the number was large compared to the number of elementary particles estimated to exist in the universe. So the implication of that finding, I think, is that at least the sort of simple-minded statistical correlational technique that says, well, you're getting 4 million prescriptions a day, you're getting these all checked by pharmacists, so now all you need to do is to give me the list of the ones that are good and the list of the ones that are bad, and my general statistical algorithm will tell you what's going on, that might not work. At least a little bit more analysis is going to be required. Now, it would be very nice to have a program that could automatically do for a given area what we did by hand, namely work out a simple semantic grammar that describes it. And that's actually a problem that I and some other people are working on now. But I would say that you could call that a statistics problem, but I wouldn't. I would call it a kind of linguistic problem. And I think there are going to be plenty of problems of that kind of all sorts. There are sociological problems, there are linguistic problems, there are psychological problems, there are physical problems, and so on. And some of my best friends are statisticians. I don't play one on TV, but I occasionally sort of pretend in class to teach some statistics at least. So I'm not opposed to statistics, and as Jeff said, I've been in favor of big data, the bigger the better, for a long time, but I don't think it's going to do away with the need for intelligence.
I totally agree, and in fact, I think in some ways it's going to make social scientists more valuable because it's going to make us better at what we do. So we can use, I think, from the perspective of a sociologist, like the bigness of big data is not the most exciting thing to me. I think it's also that the data is better than the data that we had before, at least for the kinds of problems that sociologists are interested in. And so what is it about this new data that makes it better? It's lots of different things. So one thing is it's often, since it's being recorded automatically, it's often longitudinal. Whereas in social science, we've often had to make do with sort of cross-sectional or one-time data. And it's very difficult to understand a dynamic process with an observational sort of snapshot. But it's also not just that we can answer the questions that we used to ask better. It's also exciting because it gives us new questions to ask. And so one of the things we've heard some is you have to start with a problem. And I would actually sort of disagree with that a little bit. I would say you have to have a problem, but that doesn't have to be where you start, at least for the kinds of research that we do. So to give an example, there's a student named John Palmer who's doing his dissertation at Princeton, and he's studying segregation, but in a new way. So one thing sociologists have studied for a long time is residential segregation. Where is it that people live? How can you measure how segregated cities are? How does that change over time? What are the consequences of this for individuals? And this has been a very interesting and important sort of body of work. And then you start to think, like, well, why are we studying residential segregation? It's just because we have data on where people live. But now we can have data on where people are. So we can study segregation in space and time. So here, the ability to do new kinds of measurements raises lots of new questions. So how do we quantify this? What are the causes? How can we predict what areas will be highly segregated in space or in time? What are the consequences of this for people? So it didn't start with a problem. It started with an idea that now we have this new data. Now we need to come up with a clear and clean problem to take advantage of what we can do now that we couldn't do before.
Did you want to?
I think in every scientific area, there are many, many stories of that kind now in increasing numbers coming along. And one of the things that this means, I think, is that there is a kind of sense in which that Wired article, there was something to it. Because I think the big data change, the big data revolution, whatever we want to call it, has changed at least the conventional way that people think about the relationship between science and technology. So one of the schools that I'm in at the University of Pennsylvania is the School of Engineering and Applied Science, and that name implies the traditional notion of the relationship, which is that engineering is an application of scientific principles. First you figure out how the world works, and then you figure out how to change it in ways that you want. I think this has never entirely been true. It's often, maybe always been the case that technology produces instruments and techniques that scientists can then use to ask and answer interesting questions. But I think it's become especially true now that engineering is producing techniques. For example, the techniques that allow people to be located in space and time, and that data to be collected and analyzed. That allow the same kind of thing to be done with reef fish or elephants or howler monkeys for the people who study animal behavior of animals other than humans, and every other kind of thing of that kind. Those are abilities that emerged out of engineering developments, but they offer amazing vistas for asking and answering scientific questions.
Yeah, and I think let me just add a little bit about the humanities side of this. From my own point of view, for example, I'm into Google Books, for all that it's a metadata train wreck. Is big enough so that you can still draw all kinds of generalizations. I'm interested in the way vocabularies emerge. A whole set of words will emerge at the same time and increase in frequency together. In the 1970s, you got all of these words that involved, but taken from marketing and applied to social class. So demographic, which was this obscure technical adjective that's been in the language since 1880, suddenly shoots up in frequency, and lifestyle and yuppie and the plural demographics appears, and all of this stuff goes on, trendy. And if you plot it in Google Books, you can just see all of these words increasing in frequency at the same rate, and look at the unit of analysis as a vocabulary rather than as individual words. Over at Stanford, Franco Moretti, who's a brilliant literary critic, and his group have done a lot of work with a set of, they're interested in the novel, but not the novel as studied via Dickens or Thackeray or Trollope or whatever, but the novel as studied in terms of a corpus of about 4,000 Victorian novels. And throwing cycles at it, they can ask questions like, is there a novelistic sentence? Is there a novelistic voice, and is there a novelistic sentence? And do that over this large corpus. Now, it has people in English terrified, these people who have spent their lives poring over lines of Emily Dickinson. But it does suggest, and as you say, that the technology makes available new ways of asking new questions that take you in different directions.
One other point that I want to make is that from the point of view of applications in other disciplines, especially, big data is a kind of a moving target. There's a sort of a data size blue shift or data inflation or something like that, which is happening here because I'm old enough so that things that when I was an undergraduate were sort of Borgesian fantasies, things that you could only imagine doing in a science fiction novel, are now the kind of, they became merely heroic efforts 15 years later, and by now they're the kind of thing that you can assign as a homework problem in an undergraduate course. And so there are, and the same thing is true looking forward into the future. So there are things that we can very easily do now that were unthinkable just a few years ago. And the things that require a large Hadoop cluster now, in 10 or 15 years, people will be doing on individual whatever kind of computing engines people are then using, which is harder to predict than the fact that they'll be bigger and faster and connected in new kinds of ways. So I think it would be a mistake for those of you in the audience who are scientists, if there are any, to think that in order to participate in this process, you can't do it unless you have access to a big cluster or unless you're willing to learn to use parallel processing techniques or whatever. Those are great, and I would certainly encourage you to learn them, but there are a lot of things, there are a lot of very interesting things that you can do on your laptop, and the set of things that you can do on your laptop will grow according to Moore's law and the availability of data in such a way that the things that your colleagues are now doing on their clusters, you'll be able to do without any really special care before long.
I remember many years ago at Xerox PARC, about 1992, Larry Macinter, who's a computer scientist now at Adobe, said to me in this visionary way, there will be a time when you can get everything that was ever written into the trunk of your gremlin, he said. So you've also spoken of the way in which this makes failure a less onerous risk.
Well, I think it's very important, actually, not to be too big in all respects, because heroic projects require a lot of expense and time and effort, and so you want to be very, very careful that they don't fail. You want to be, an earlier speaker talked about seeking the mess or something like that, looking for allowing things to break and so on. You don't want that to happen if you're spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on a project, or even if you're spending millions of dollars on a project. But if it's something that you can try over a couple of days, why not? And so I think it's extremely important that in this ecosystem of data-intensive science and technology, there's a big range of sizes of projects, including projects where it's perfectly fine to fail, because the individual investment is not too bad. And so you can try them even if you don't really think there's much hope that they'll succeed, because sometimes they do. Or sometimes you learn things from them even if they don't quite work.
One question of particular interest for the social sciences, and I include linguistics here, is the relationship of these techniques and the observations they permit to theory. When I think about the history of sociology, for example, I mean, from Parsons to Giddens and Garfinkel, and so each of these approaches, Goffman is grounded in a certain kind of observational material. And the question is, how do you see, for example, the work that you and your colleagues and your students are doing as driving new theoretical orientations?
Yeah, I think one thing is that observing new patterns in society gives us new things to theorize about. So that's one hand. And on the other hand, having access to different kinds of data allows us to test theories better, but in a specific way. That I think a useful idea is this concept of a strategic research site that was described by the sociologist Robert Merton. And it's that certain places, certain aspects of the social world may not be of general interest, but they may be very important for understanding certain kinds of problems. So an example is identical twins. And so we don't really care that much in some kind of objective sense about identical twins, but they're a beautiful strategic research site because by studying identical twins and comparing them to fraternal twins, we can learn something about nature and nurture, which is something that we care about a lot. So it's often the case that if you get the right data, then that gives you a lot of leverage on big theoretical problems, not necessarily having the most data. And so we've heard a lot about, when I hear people talk about big data, it's often, oh, I can go out and I can scrape all this stuff, or there's all this data in my database already in my company. And that's cool. There's probably good stuff there. But I think it's very unlikely to be the case that the most interesting and the most important data is already there. Right? It's likely to be the case that you have to go out and actively seek out what it is that's the most interesting data. So in the Moneyball example, they figured out what was the data that they needed to collect, and then they went out and collected it. And so we haven't talked very much about sort of big data, new ways of collecting data in addition to just analyzing the data that happens to be lying around.
I'd actually like to underline that with respect to what I think is one of the lessons of the big data era for engineering, not for science. This was a point that I made in the medical breakout downstairs. In the middle of the 1980s, some people at the National Security Agency who have plenty of data and did then, and they have big computers and did then, and they have very, very smart people and did then, but they decided that they could make faster progress on algorithmic development in areas that mattered to them if they recruited researchers in the unclassified open world. And they did this by creating a process that came to be called the common task method. So you define a problem that you want a solution to. It's not actually the problem you want to have solved. It's a problem which is like the problem that you want to have solved, or like enough that you think that progress on it will be helpful. You define in advance an explicit computational metric for scoring how well an algorithm does in solving that problem. You create a large body of training and testing data. You arrange for someone to create an open call for research to work on this problem. You hire the National Institute of Science and Technology to run the tests. And every 6 months or every 9 months or every year, you arrange for everyone who wants to compete, including not only the people who are being funded, but the people who are not being funded and just want a gold star, to come try their algorithms against your technology. So this has been done in, I believe NIST has now run open competitions in nearly 20 technological areas since the mid-1980s. And the fact that you have access to technologies that do things like entity tagging, like speech recognition, like speaker recognition, like language recognition, like large-scale document retrieval, like document classification, and so on, is largely due to that process. It was an enormous success. And it's been adopted in lots of other areas. It's been adopted for the development of autonomous vehicles. It's been adopted in image processing. It's been adopted by some companies, as in the case of the Netflix challenge, and so on. So that idea of taking, by the standards of the 1980s and 1990s, very large amounts of data, and large amounts of data coupled with very specific and very precisely defined problems, and then inviting people to compete to solve those problems, has been an enormous driver of engineering success. And I think that there's something similar that is just starting to happen in various areas of science. So in the case of something called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, the National Institutes of Mental Health has started collecting longitudinal data on a bunch of patients, elderly patients, people like me with mild cognitive impairment, and collecting neuroimaging data, clinical evaluations, and cognitive testing, and making this data available to any bona fide researcher who is interested in it, the goal being to find better ways to predict clinical progress. Because the fact is, if one of you is worried that perhaps things are starting to slip a little bit, and you go to the doctor, and they take blood tests, and they do brain imaging, and they give you cognitive tests, and they have an interview with you, and so on, they can tell you what your current state is, but they can't predict worth a damn where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years. and many people would like to see that improved. So rather than just have this be limited to the data that one hospital can gather and its doctors or statisticians can interpret, they want to make this data available to everyone to try to compete to see who can create the algorithm that will make the best predictions.
One place that naturally leads for both of you is this question of the availability of data. In the case of natural language study, it's a matter of creating corpora. I should say that Mark was the motor force behind, actually the creator of the Linguistic Data Consortium. Was it 92 or something that it began? Which is an enormous collection of linguistic corpora, speech, writing, a number. I don't know how many different languages you have there now.
27.
27.
Well,
only
we have
27.
something in more than 60. But.
Which has been an invaluable research resource, but there's lots more stuff to be collected. And in sociology as well, you've got the questions of gathering corpora, and also sociologists have spent large parts of their careers generating corpora in the form of surveys and something, and I would imagine that this changes the way you think of survey design.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the things about big data is that although lots of it exists, it's not accessible to us. A lot of the things are stored inside of places that we can't get to, and for good reason. There are privacy complications, and businesses have this data and they think it's a competitive advantage and so on. So I think that I'm focusing a lot of my efforts on how we can collect better data on our own. So I'm working now on a project to try to develop a new kind of survey that we call a Wiki Survey. So just like Wikipedia evolves over time based on user input, you could imagine a survey that evolves over time based on user input. And so this would solve a problem that we have with surveys, which is that we have to write all the questions and all the answers ahead of time. So that makes it very hard to actually learn something new in a survey because we've very tightly constrained the kinds of things that we can, the kinds of input that can come in. So an alternative to that is things like interviews and focus groups, which are great for having new information come into you, but they're also slow and expensive and hard to quantify. And so these wiki surveys try to be a hybrid that combine the quantifiability you get from a survey with the openness that you get from an interview. And then this is part of a sort of general belief that I have that having the right data is much better than having the wrong data and trying to do a complicated fix to it at the end. So you sometimes see people try to solve a problem. They have some data, and they say, well, this is the data I have, and it has these 3 problems, and so I've built these complicated statistical procedures to deal with this, and that's rarely as convincing as having the right data. And in some sense, I think this sociologist John Goldthorpe talked about the difference between historians and sociologists. And maybe not something a lot of people here are thinking about. But he said historians are stuck with working with relics. They're stuck trying to learn from the things that have survived from the past. Whereas sociologists have a huge advantage in that they can actually collect the data that they want. They can tailor-make the stuff to try to learn what it is that's most important to them. And so I think the big gains for social scientists, in my opinion, will come from new ways of tailoring data, not necessarily fancier ways of working with the relics that have been created for other purposes.
Do you see an analogy in linguistics?
Well, I would just add one thing, which is that current social science survey techniques, many of them actually, unfortunately, throw away 99.9% of the data they gather because they make up a questionnaire. This has some multiple choice questions and it has some open-ended questions. They send out people either on the telephone to do interviews or face-to-face to do interviews, and they ask each respondent each of the multiple choice questions and then the open-ended questions. The multiple choice questions is something like, well, who are you going to vote for? Answer possible is Obama, Romney, not sure. But mostly people don't just say Obama, Romney, not sure. They say, I'm not sure, and then they could go off in a bunch of different directions. They could say, that Obama's a Kenyan socialist, but that Romney, I don't trust him because, or they could say something very different because not sure. Any answer could cover a lot of ground, and lots of people will volunteer extra information. That is all, of course, thrown away. It's recorded, and it's filed in climate-controlled archive and never looked at again by anybody. The open-ended questions are transcribed, are recorded and transcribed. They figure out a coding manual so that they can turn them into multiple choice questions, and they hire some people to listen to them or read the transcripts and code them, and then they throw away the transcripts and the recordings. We've just been working with the people at the American National Election Survey, which does every presidential election cycle a number of quite large surveys by social science standards involving 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 people in order to get access to some of the raw data. I was mentioning to Matt that the files that are available on the web, which you can all get for the American National Election Survey, include things that are called raw data. But what they mean by raw data is the multiple choice answers to questions by individual. They don't mean the actual recordings and transcripts. So we're of course interested in the data because of all the things that are not related to the multiple choice answers, like how strongly people feel or what their reasons are or whatever. But their interest is our promise that we can do automated coding and save them a lot of money. So we'll try to make everyone happy.
Let me ask one brief question before turning this to audience questions. And I should say that because of the late start, we're going to go to the quarter after the hour in this session and then move everything back commensurately. How does this change the relationship of social science, in particular social sciences that you know, to industry?
It's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of smart people in industry doing interesting things, and I wish more of them would publish what they're doing in journals so that we can all learn from it and benefit. And some people have been doing that, and I think there's actually a great benefit to that, not just to society, but also to them. So I think the scientific peer review process, some people talk about the discipline of the market and how that forces you to be better and better in what you do. And I think that there's a discipline to the peer review process. And so if you know that what you're doing is going to go out for review and be carefully scrutinized by other scientists in other places, that forces you to be better and better. And so if you're doing your analytics and you're only evaluating it with other people inside of your company, you're not going through a sort of peer review process where then you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. And it's often been the case that I worked on a paper for a really long time and I thought it was awesome, sent it to a journal, and it got torn up by the reviewers. And of course, that was crushing. But then after that, you think about it a little bit more, you're like, wow, that's right. There's really ways that this can be a lot better. And then the work gets better. And over time, as a community, we can all start doing better and better research.
I would just add that there's one very important practical benefit, which is that American higher education has got the problem of a supply-demand imbalance for graduate students. That is, there are more graduate students than there are academic jobs for them when they graduate. And one of the things that we've found in training linguistic students to do linguistic research using these techniques is that about half of them wind up taking industrial jobs. And that helps a lot with this particular supply-demand imbalance. And we think that it's good for the industries that hire them, who generally like what they get.
When Mark and I were in graduate school, the only thing you could do was teach English as a second language to foreign graduate students for a lower hourly rate than you make at Microsoft.
Yes, although actually when I finished graduate school, I wound up going to Bell Labs rather than into academia, so it wasn't unheard of, but it was rare in those days.
And it's still rare in sociology, so people in industry, you should start hiring art grad students also.
Well, and you should start training your graduate students so that people in industry want to hire them.
That's true, too.
Let me open this to questions. Over there, yeah.
I actually have a follow-up question directly on it. Hold on. Let me bring you the microphone.
Yeah, please wait for the mic to make its way to you.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on that, which is that I think that humanities and social science students actually are probably well kind of situated to participate in big data for any kind of domain. But what kind of skills do you think they need to be trained in to really help out?
Great question.
Well, there's some obvious things. Certain areas of mathematics, linear algebra and its applications, whether in signal processing or in statistics, programming, and so on, machine learning.
In addition to those, I would say in sociology, a big thing is research design. So one of the things that we see in sociology, we often collect data, and collecting data is very expensive for us. And so there's been a lot of thinking about what it is that you can learn from a given piece of data, and what are different designs that you can do to maximize the leverage that you can get out of your data. And so a lot of times, having lots of data, if the design is not right, then you can go really wrong. And often, having seen many, many examples of research designs and seeing how those are scrutinized by other researchers, you can start to have a sense of when you see some data, you can ask questions about how was this data collected, what about this other issue. And so through this sort of accumulated experience of thinking about research design, I think you can help avoid making mistakes with the data that you have, and you can collect future data in a more efficient way.
Anno, is that?
This has been really fascinating. But I have one of the reasons I wanted these guys to come is I wanted to hear about their work, too. So I would love it if Matt and Mark would just say a few words about the way they use big data in their own work.
Sure. Most of the work I've done with big data has been actually trying to collect the data myself rather than use pre-existing data sources because of this need to tailor the data collection to get exactly what you want. So my dissertation research, which was we built a website where people could come and download new music, but we could control the information that people had about what other people were doing experimentally. So we could study fads in this sort of laboratory-style setting, but at a much larger scale than people had been able to do before. So our experiments had 27,000 people, which by web standards is not very big, but it's a factor of 100 bigger than what you normally would do with undergrads in a lab. And that allowed us to use a different kind of experimental design that people hadn't used before. And so once it's like really a qualitative kind of change, and that allows us to address this. People have studied fads for a long time, but because we had access to this scale, we could use a different kind of design, which helped us understand this problem better. And then more recently, this work I've been doing about how we can try to do surveys in a way that's much more open to new information that combines the best features of surveys with the best features of interviews.
Mark?
One of the long-standing issues in the study of human speech and language is the relationship between signals and symbols. So when we think of speech and the gestures and so on that go along with it, everything flows smoothly from one point in time to another. There are arbitrarily many intermediate states. There are lots of possible ending points. Pretty much no matter how you choose to record and represent and process that, you see smooth distributions in many dimensions. On the other hand, we know that from the point of view of speech and language understanding, there's a translation somehow to a limited number of distinctive phonemes, a limited number of words. So there isn't something halfway between cat and dog. There might be, you could imagine an animal that was halfway in between, but its name wouldn't be some kind of average, weighted average of cat and dog. Although you could take a weighted average of a recording of the word cat and a recording of the word dog. So anyway, big data, that is very large amounts of transcribed speech, found data, recorded telephone conversations, interviews in the laboratory, thousands of hours of broadcast data, Supreme Court oral argument recordings, and so on. All of this kind of stuff gives you the possibility of looking at this relationship between the symbolic representation, symbolic level of representation, and the actual signals in new ways. And I won't, if you're interested in some of the details of those studies, I can send you papers or talk about it, but let's just say that this offers, rather than if you have an idea, rather than having to say, all right, what are the words we're going to get people to read? What are the sentences we're going to put them in? Now let's recruit 100 people to come in and spend an hour each recording stuff. You just go to the your repositories of data and issue a query, and now you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of examples that are relevant to the question you want to ask.
I can just add one thing. If you want to see an extraordinary collection of these kitchen table experiments that Mark was alluding to, go to the Language Log blog, in which he is first among equals and one of the founders and certainly the most prolific contributor. People will make statements or assertions and so on, and half an hour later, Mark has got an analysis of a couple million words that shows it's true or false. Most notably, there was a meme making the rounds, still making the rounds, about Obama's use of the first-person pronoun, that his narcissism is evidenced in his frequent use of I and me and so on. So Mark said, well, let's find out. And I don't know how long, maybe an hour, 2 hours to do it. He looked at all the speeches and press conferences, or a large set of Obama's 3 predecessors, and discovered, no, in fact, Obama uses the first-person pronoun less than any of them. Not that that's stopped anybody from repeating this, but that's another story. Another question.
Hi. Since this is the DataEDGE conference, I thought I'd raise an edgy question, and it's okay if you don't want to answer it. But today we've heard a lot about sort of the types of questions that are asked and the types of data that are collected, and then like from that, what are the methods of analysis, and then we're looking at sociological insights about our society. And there's sort of an unspoken elephant in the room in technical fields today, which is the precipitously declining rates of women choosing to enter these fields in education, and also in choosing to drop out once they're in the professional worlds, either in academia or in corporations, with sort of like an average career length of 10 years. And like how, this is sort of the sociology of this space. If we're serious about this, we have to think about gender and how it's reflected in who are those next generation of professionals. So I wanted to, it's not quite a question, but it's like, it's an elephant in this room I just thought we should name.
So I've been very impressed with what the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon was able to do starting about 10 or 12 years ago to increase the proportion of undergraduate majors that were female. I think they managed to raise it over the course of 5 or 6 years from about 5% to about 40 or 45%. And this was partly a matter of recruitment and partly a matter of retention strategies. And we've tried with somewhat less success to accomplish a similar thing at the university where I am. The one thing that I'm quite proud of is that the Linguistic Data Consortium, which is this organization that Jeff talked about, it's actually an activity of the University of Pennsylvania, but it creates and publishes and distributes resources that are used for mostly speech and language technology research, although some psychologists and linguists and sociologists and so forth also make use of the data. We have 55 full-time employees, and approximately half of them are female. I just came back from a trip to a data resources conference in Istanbul. It was held by the European Language Data Association, or sponsored by them. And 12 people from LDC gave papers there, and 8 of them were female. So I don't, when we could talk about what some of the problems and issues are that lead to the fact that a majority of the people in this room are male, and that a majority of people in most similar gatherings are male. But I think it's not a necessity of the world, so to speak. It's something that can be adjusted.
We have I want to take 2 last questions in the corner, and then we'll.
Okay, I was going to say, with Obama's I problem, there may have been a data quality problem there because his 2 predecessors had to say I a lot, and it just may have been transcribed incorrectly in that case. But seriously, folks, the engine of this is an enormous number of connected devices disappearing into enormous computing repositories. And I'd like to turn that phenomenon on the academy itself, what you think of this. I was at MIT last week talking to the edX guys, and they're teaching 120,000 people at once online. And it surfaces these kind of interesting talents and skills where, people have to ask each other, post questions, and other students just answer them online for them. You develop this self-tutoring, which is a kind of new emerging skill. And then, earlier today I was talking to somebody who's talking about doing online training for a more rigorous graduate level, and there's an issue of how you qualify people to enter the course. How do you find a common standard people can agree on and then teach against that? As this becomes more pervasive, how do you think this will affect the academy?
I think it's one of the most exciting things that's happening right now in education. So instead of teaching hundreds of people, we can teach hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. And that's awesome. We should be so excited about that. I think it will create a lot of challenges to be resolved, but I think it will also help us to focus more on, it will make us all better teachers. So I've been thinking to myself, what is it that I do in the classroom that can't be replaced by a video on YouTube? And that's good that I'm thinking that, because hopefully that's going to make me a better teacher. So I think it's going to be good for the people that have access now. It's going to be good for the people who are already sort of in these universities traditionally. And I think the last thing is that it's going to dramatically expand the size of the pie. So the number of people who want to learn stuff is much bigger than people who are between 18 and 22 who want to start a course in September, then the course that lasts 14 weeks. Like just in the way that like a book is not necessarily the best unit to package a certain piece of information. So sometimes there's like magazine articles and there's books, and you've sometimes read a book and you thought, this book probably could have been a magazine article. And I think there are lots of ideas where you could have a really great 3-week course on that, and that just doesn't fit into the current structure that we have. So by opening up the structure to allow for these new kinds of things to emerge, I think it's going to be really exciting.
I'll just add that my friend Dan Jarowski at Stanford taught computational linguistics to approximately 100,000 people through Coursera this last term. And Penn and Princeton have now joined with Stanford in Coursera. And my friend Al Filreis in the English department at Penn is going to be teaching modern American poetry to however many people want to sign up next fall. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. But I think behind your question is a very important issue about what will this do to the value of residential education, so to speak, of going to Berkeley or going to Penn or going to Stanford or going to Princeton, and also paying large amounts of money to do that. And I think none of us really know. It remains to be seen. I comfort myself with two thoughts. One is that I'm close to being able to retire, so I can watch with interest and less financial interest in the old sense. And the second thought is that when I think back to my own undergraduate days, I do feel that I learned much less in the classroom than I did in other parts of the experience from my classmates and from other people that I met there. And so I have a feeling that there will be ways in which sort of residential communities will remain, will add some value for some time. Pardon?
MIT is not losing out.
Not so far.
When I hear these numbers, I always have this vision of you there, 7,000, 12th row back, 247th from the right. You look puzzled. You know? We have one last question, and then we.
Okay, one last question.
Could I?
It's up there, I think.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay. So the question really is about if you go back to the small data, the little data days. The data often were cross-sectional, and they also were based on random probability samples. And social science education emphasized that, and so people learned, the general linear model, regression, and extensions from that. In this era, we do have data that are continuous, much more granular, and also usually very far from being anywhere close to the assumptions of random probability samples. Same thing occurs on the commercial side. I work in media. Nielsen television panels are not at all commensurate with data that flows in from cable set-top box data that capture only a part of television viewing. How do you see this being reconciled going forward, and how does it affect the kinds of statistics that get taught in the social sciences and the approaches, apart from the reverence for design, which I agree with quite a bit?
Well, very briefly, people need to learn mixed effects models or hierarchical regression models, among other things, because otherwise applying regular linear regression is a recipe for getting nonsense out, I think.
Sure, and I think the other thing is that we're going to have to come up with clever ways of combining the non-random data that we have with carefully designed high-quality data. So in machine learning, they talk about, you need this ground truth data. If you have some ground truth data, then you can use that to leverage lots of other things and make predictions. So I think there's going to be, like in the same way that the Google flu trend sort of combines the Google data, which is messy and non-representative, with the CDC data, which is high quality and based on these kinds of designs that we have learned over time are very valuable. So in the same way that you can marry those things, I think we're going to see lots of creative ways of trying to unlock a lot of the value that's in this messy, non-probability sample data by adding just a touch of this highly designed data. And with that, if we can figure out how to do that well, we can unlock a lot of information that would otherwise be hard to interpret.
So let's end. Yes, please.
I want to build on Scott's comment and come back to something Matt said, as I hope a way to close up the session by pointing us back to Anno's remarks at the very beginning. This is about educating a new generation of data-savvy professionals, and I happen to believe that social scientists will have a central role in that. And I wonder, as you think through the challenge of research design, and acknowledge that that's different across the social science disciplines, that there is no unified social science. There are linguists using R, and there are political scientists using R, and there are sociologists using R. Do you see a common curriculum for all of them, or do you see something that needs to be more granular? I ask in part because the challenge of teaching research design is something that we're facing here at Berkeley as we build our social science data laboratory. How much is there that's shared across the huge disciplinary strengths that we have?
Some, but not everything, but I think there would be a great value for students to be exposed to the research design issues that come up in other fields. So one of the things that I've loved about this conference is that we were talking over beer last night, and I learned a lot about the kinds of design challenges that you face in linguistics. Like, I wish I had known that stuff before, because it makes me think about data in new ways. So I think even though some of the stuff may not seem directly relevant at the time the students are learning it, having that exposure will really pay off for them down the road.
Let me just add that for all that these techniques and applications are going to be enormously influential across the social sciences and across linguistics and even the humanities, I don't think there's any risk that some of the traditional modes of learning, of some of the traditional methods are going to remain. I mean, archival work is still going to be there for historians. Ethnographers are still going to be doing ethnography. Literary scholars are still going to be doing close reading. And the hysteria that some of this stuff evokes in people in the humanities and social sciences isn't justified, I think, for that reason.
Okay, let's give these guys a big hand.